Disorder having broken out.
So, hi everybody. I would like to welcome you all back to Praxis TV and to say a massive welcome to Osman Baig, who's joining us today. Osman is a stage and screen actor based in London and Yorkshire, known for roles in Richard III, Bittersweet, Requiem for a Puppet. And the one that I have a link to Osman through is The Acting Class, which is a film that was put together by Deirdre O'Neill, and who is a mutual friend, I think, or mutual contact. Yeah. And it also says on your Twitter, Osman, that you're a telly producer and a playwright, and that you are or have been a journalist. So I'd like to hear more about that in a bit, but just to say welcome and thanks for coming on.
Right, thank you for having me.
Okay, brilliant. So before we go into any more of that side of your life, I will ask you the same question that I always usually ask everybody first off. And that question is, are you working class?
Yeah, I am. I would say so. I grew up, first of all, I think it's very interesting how we define working class. And I'm always very cautious to sort of present credentials as to why I am one thing or, why I am proving that I am X, Y, or Z. Because a lot of people might sort of listen to the way I talk and think, well, you don't sound working class. You don't sound actually necessarily northern. And I think that an issue is that we have a stereotype of what it means to be working class, and that has been sort of fed to us by a lot of TV and film and media. And I think that working class is something else. I think it is the idea of, it's really interesting. Chris Rock had an example about the Black experience in America, and he said that you can be rich as a Black person, but you're never wealthy. And the idea was that it's, Oprah can be the person with the $1 million checks, but it's the person at the bank giving her the money who's really wealthy. I define middle class as having had that sort of inherited privilege in some way, that sense of financial stability, that sense of education continuously running, an opportunity continuously running through generations. Whereas in my family, that was not the case. My parents were immigrants from Pakistan, living a very kind of Spartan lifestyle when they first moved to the UK in council flats when we were growing up, having very, very little money. And it was, my mum worked as a dinner lady. My dad, they'd had educations in Pakistan, but there were so many barriers at that time in the 60s. That for us growing up, there wasn't all of those things like swimming lessons, school trips abroad, all of those things that I think many people might take for granted. That was something that was a real struggle. And, a lot of that was money. And they eventually, they were that generation that were very sensible and saved their pennies. And that was how eventually we were able to get an education and to go to university and be upwardly mobile. But it was through the working element of it. It was the fact that they worked as a couple, as a class, as a community to get those opportunities. It was not sort of expected of anyone to achieve anything necessarily. And I think that is how I define working class. It is the working element. It's the fight to get where you want to in the world.
Yeah, and then maybe the level of aspiration that you have is to do with your sort of subliminal understanding or your practical understanding of what's likely and what's likely realistic. It's going to be very different for middle class families for their children than it will be for working class parents and their children.
Yeah, for sure. And that was something that I didn't really even realize until until I started working. I got a scholarship to university to do journalism, which was really exciting. But I didn't really realize until I got into the news, until I actually got on that course that, such and such is the daughter of a millionaire. Or, this person has kind of already done all these amazing work placements with big companies. It's like, it turns out that their father's really well connected or whatever. And it felt quite alien. You do feel a lot of the time when you are entering that world for the first time that you're a bit of an imposter, and it's a kind of fake it till you make it thing. And I think that is another element of being working class, and it's a class aspect in this country, that there is always an unspoken sense of being that outsider when you're leveling up, I guess.
You can feel it yourself. Yeah, you're aware
Yeah.
of it. Yeah. Do you think that other people? So are you a Yorkshire man? Is that where you've grown
So
up?
yeah, I'm from
Yeah.
Bradford. Yeah,
Yeah. So
and
but
yeah,
you speak so nicely. Is that because of the training that you've had, or is it just?
yeah, partly. I mean, I have lived outside of Yorkshire, of Bradford, for quite a while now, about
Yeah.
15 years, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, it is the drama training and the, speaking for broadcast and whatnot.
Yes.
But it does come back when I'm there, when I'm home, it definitely comes back, speaking on the phone to family, for sure.
That's what I get as well, because I grew up on the Wirral, which is near Liverpool. And to some people, I sound posh, but to other people, I sound Scouse. And
Yeah,
but I don't know. It's like, I think even if you don't have a strong, typically northern or typically working class accent, or what would be associated with being working class, my feeling is that other people, even if you spoke really, really beautifully, there are other things that give you away in terms of your
yeah.
class. So that people who have all of these kind of scaffolding and privileges that you just described in the office when you went into journalism and your scholarship, the people who have that scaffolding and that preparation and all of that support, they can sense that there's a class difference. They pick it up somehow, even if it's not through your voice or.
Yeah, and it's, I think, experiences when you start talking about things. It's like, oh, you don't go to Chamonix for your skiing holiday, or
Yeah.
you don't necessarily have cultural references or cultural markers, and they can be quite subtle as well.
Mm-hmm.
Even just, I suppose it's hard to say. I can't really think of any concrete examples right now, but I was just thinking, even dinner times, we always in our family would have dinner at 6 p.m. And
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize it was sort of a thing in the south of the country to eat later.
Mm-hmm.
So we were always having what we'd call tea at like 5 or 6 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
and not realizing that actually most people in London and, in this world that I was in were eating at, sort of 7 or 8 nights, which is, and it's a very subtle thing, and it's probably different for every family.
Mm-hmm.
But it's little things like that which make you think, oh, when those moments chime, you're like, yes, okay, there is a little bit of a difference here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think sometimes they call it supper. Sometimes I've heard
Yeah,
middle
I've
class.
always been confused, because I think that it's like, isn't that just a soup you have before bedtime? And supper is sort of like a weird, mysterious concept to me, in all honesty.
Definitely. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's just those little things, or I suppose it's different now because I am a lot older. I'm in my late 30s now. You kind of accrue and you acclimatize, and after a certain point in your life, it's less about your upbringing, I suppose, and more about kind of what you have right now in your own existence and world. So. But I do remember I remember having to go in very gung-ho and just having to pretend to be quite confident. And
Right.
I think it really did help, though, because I think I had such a passion for the subject. And the great thing with the news is the story is constantly changing. So you are always really only ever talking about what's happening on the day. So it... in a way that was quite helpful because it gave everyone the same canvas to work from. Whereas I think if I was going into something more old school, I don't know, like, say insurance or in the city, where it's very much, who knows who and what deals are being brokered, where I think I definitely feel a lot more alien, because that's absolutely not anything that I could connect to or would have had anyone, would have known anyone in that world.
So the kinds of work that you've done, how was it that you moved then from journalism into more acting, writing?
Yeah, so it was a bit of an unusual trajectory because I kind of trained late. I was actually 30 when I trained for drama school, and I had done amateur stuff, and I had done just sort of classes and stuff as a hobby and as a fun, really. And it was one of the teachers who gave me the idea of doing it professionally. Now, that was something that I just thought that you had to be born into. It was the idea of being an actor. I mean, it was like being, saying, oh, I want to become an astronaut. It was just that alien that you could have that as a job. It just felt like that was just not my world, and it never would be. And it was really this teacher who said, well, I really think that you should apply for one of the drama schools, and I think that you'd have to, they explained to me, this is the trajectory, you go and you do an MA and you may get picked up by an agent and they will slowly start to put you out for jobs. And they said, you could be at an advantage because you are a little bit older and you have your ethnic background. And right now there is a push to try and get more diversity on the agents' books. So yeah, it was quite an unusual trajectory in that I trained quite late. And I was able to pay for it because of the money that I'd saved from journalism. And that's another thing. I don't think I would have had the opportunity to go into this at 18. Mm-hmm. I don't, if I'd said to my parents, I don't want to, I originally did a law degree, and this was before you had to pay for tuition fees, before doing the journalism scholarship. And I think if I'd said to my parents at 18, no, I want to now go to drama school, it would just have been a total no-go, because that's not the sort of profession that is considered stable and is going to help you earn money and establish a life for yourself. It is, many parents would feel that, but I think from a working class background and from an Asian background as well, there is extra pressure. So it was because I'd saved up the money and I'd always kept an interest, that I then had the means to apply for the full-time scholarship. And then since then, I have been doing my journalism work part-time and then also acting where I can. And a lot of that acting has been in the play that I've written for myself, Fake News, which is based on my work, my work in journalism and that world. And that is, for me, that was really important because it was a good way to combine all of my experience so far and make it into a product that was unique artistically.
Mm-hmm. So does the play Fake News, does it touch on, is it talking about bias within the media, or is it talking about class? What kind of themes does it cover?
Well, definitely class and money, actually, not so much bias. It's really interesting because I think the media as a concept, we tend to think of it as this homogenous entity. But what I realized quite early on when I began working for big companies was that most of the time, they are really, really struggling themselves. News does not make money. This is the thing, actually. News is a loss maker for big companies. So somewhere like Sky B, they get a lot of money from Sky One and all of their dramas and films. But something like Sky News is not making them money, and it may indeed be making them a loss. But they keep it because it has prestige and it has influence. And it's sort of watched by powerful people. But there is very, very, very little money in news itself. And often what that means is they take a lot of young people, and I was one of these people, and push them into quite advanced senior roles very quickly on a low salary, I would say. But because we're young and we're keen and this is our first big break, we're really, really desperate to do anything. And, because we're not students anymore, it's like any salary seems like a positive
bonus thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So the play is really about how that leads to errors and fakeness by accident within the world of news. In this story, my character publishes a story that's factually incorrect. It's completely fake. But he does so not because he has an agenda or not because there's any bias, but because he's just so overworked, underpaid. He's on a night shift. He's desperate to try and impress not only his boss, but his other colleagues who come from very privileged backgrounds. And he wants to prove that he is just as good and just as capable. And unfortunately, what he does is he takes a misstep. And because of the way that everything is strung together with these sort of purse strings, it does fall through the cracks. And that's what the story is about. It's sort of humanizing the fact that news is not this ivory tower, which we might ascribe it to. It really is ordinary people doing the best they can with quite limited resources.
That's quite an interesting insight. I wonder, so being in that environment, within that career, sort of a young person, not particularly well paid, put into senior roles, obviously you get a lot of experience, but as a working class person, does that enable you then to make useful connections and contacts to progress in your career? Or are people who are from middle class backgrounds or affluent backgrounds already ahead of you? Have they got, more of a stepping stone onto the next step in their career?
Well, this is a controversial thing because it can never really be proven. But what you often find is it's the person whose dad is best friends and golfing with the boss that ends up getting a huge promotion, or it's the person whose parents are billionaires, literally, that end up getting a really good advancement in their career. And no one can say it's necessarily because of their backgrounds, but you do find, and anecdotally speaking, more often than not, people with well-off middle class, upper middle class backgrounds tend to go further. And why that is, I mean, it's really hard to say why. Is it the connections behind the scenes? Is someone pulling the purse strings? Is it also the confidence that you have when you come from that background, when you know that you can walk into a room and own it? That gives you, and we've been brought up with that sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
That gives you a power and it gives you a confidence naturally, and that, when it radiates out, is an attractive proposition. It's hard to say, and I don't think there's ever really sort of been a study in this. And of course, there are great examples. I think you're from Kay Burley is a newsreader at Sky, and I believe she's from the Wirral.
Right.
I think she really worked her way up to the top. And obviously, there are examples of people like that. But from what I have seen, for some reason, somehow, it is an easier ride if you are middle class, even when you're all starting on the same page from day one. It's just interesting who tends to go further quicker.
Yeah. There has been a big push, hasn't there, from the BBC in terms of equalities, and because I think it was a while ago, it was a couple of years ago, wasn't it, that there was a big scandal about the differences in pay scales.
Yes.
Yeah, and it was between a woman journalist and a male journalist, wasn't it, within the same role. And it was following on from that. I can't remember all the details of it, but it was following on from that there's been a noticeable difference in terms of sort of newscasters and presenters, and I don't know about whether actors, but I would imagine actors as well, who's able to produce and whose scripts are invited in. Has it gone right the way across, do you think, or?
Yes, it's interesting. I believe it was Carrie Gracie who raised that case a few years ago at the BBC, and she announced her salary on air. She said, I get £93,000. And that was quite, obviously talking about money is also such a taboo in our society. And that is such a thing that has been bolstered by the establishment, because obviously the people who if you don't talk about money, then no one knows what anyone else is earning, and therefore people can be paid less. That's where that has come from, this sense of taboo. So good for her on breaking that. I've never really worked at the BBC for an extensive amount of time. What I will say, though, is at the point of drama and general media representation, I think that there's a huge problem. And I think what it is we have become so cosmetic in how we view issues. We're so myopic. And so our idea of a working class story is to put a stereotype, a caricature of a working class character onto TV. Our idea of representation racially is to have a period drama like Bridgerton and put a black actor in and not say anything about the fact that they might be a black person in the aristocracy in the 1800s, not to mention, to have nothing about how unique that story could be, and simply to use race in a cosmetic way. And I think the real problem is that we're not getting enough diversity in the writing room. And that is the real problem, because until we get people telling their own stories, and until that becomes an attractive proposition, that the establishment, whoever is pulling the purse strings here, whoever is funding these projects, whether it's Netflix or film studios, until they realize that actually we need to hear more stories by the people whose voices need to be heard.
Definitely.
Then I think we can't keep treating diversity in such a cosmetic way. It's just it's harmful.
Yeah. So if you approach this from a tokenistic perspective, it actually causes more damage than it's more of a harm than a hindrance than a help.
Yes, for sure. So it ends up propagating. So there was a story, I'm just seeing it now, that was coming up today about the BBC saying that Luther, which is a crime drama with Idris Elba playing the main role, it is not considered diverse enough by the BBC's diversity chief. And this is to quote the report. It said that because the character, quote, doesn't have any black friends, he doesn't eat any Caribbean food, and this doesn't feel authentic. And that's from Miranda Wayland at the BBC. And I thought that was very interesting because my first reaction is, well, why should that? Why do we have to have those things for that character? I mean, I'm sure that there are lots of Black people who do not eat Caribbean food. Maybe they don't have other Black friends, but why are those things being picked up on as the most important aspect of that character's development and portrayal on screen? And this just got me to thinking, well, I wonder how many Black writers Luther has, or Black producers, or Black directors, because if you really want that authentic experience, you really need the full team. You can't just put an actor in there and then expect everything else to fall into place. That's putting, the cart before the horse. So
yeah, with creative industries, if it's not across the board, if it's only in the visible bits, like who's presenting the news and who's employed as an actor, and if it's not included in the writing, it's never going to get past that crude stage, is it? I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one thing I realized when I was getting into the world of journalism is there was, I would say, a big barrier, and I'm only speaking family, and I wonder if this is something that is perpetuated across class lines as well, or racial lines. It's the idea of just feeling like you actually shouldn't be doing that, or can't be going in that direction. I was saying earlier about the acting thing, this idea that it was so alien to me that I just would never have considered it, and the pressure within the family would have been to stay away from that sort of world because it seems fractious financially and unstable. And I wonder if maybe with politics, we need to be going into schools more and saying to working class kids, we need to hear your voice, and actually celebrating what young working class children are saying and giving them more of a platform there. And maybe that's a way to help then get them ahead into, give them a platform. I mean, give them something which they can then build on to authentically get into politics. Because I never saw anyone coming into school for really, there was hardly ever anyone in terms of visiting speakers on a political.
No, me neither.
Sense. I mean, we never had MPs visit. There was no one saying, this could be you, we need to hear what you have to say. It was just never happening. So I think we really, like, the education system needs to play a huge role.
Yeah, I agree, actually. I think the unions have started to develop education programs that they can take into schools to talk to people about what the role of a union is. So that's kind of one thing. But the other thing with that is, though, because one of the things that was raised by, I think it was Dr. Lisa McKenzie when I did an interview with her, was that she feels that working class people and working class kids, it's not that they don't have enough aspiration. They have lots of dreams and lots of hopes and lots of aspiration, but that when they by the time they get to a certain stage within the school system, somehow they realize that it's a stacked playing field and it's always going to be that. And I think we have to do both things. We have to highlight where the playing field is stacked, and the way that we do that is by discussing it and talking about it. And that's one of the really brilliant things that the acting class did. But I think someone in the acting class also said we need to, because there is a club of privilege, if you know what I mean. And they said that within the acting profession and everything that goes with that, so directing, writing, everything else, it's become a smaller and smaller nucleus of privilege over the years. And this kind of club where everybody helps each other get on, probably don't even realize they're doing it half the time. We need our own club. I think it was Maxine Peake was saying we need our own club so that working class actors, writers, directors, politicians, whoever it is, can kind of help each other, get together and provide those inspirations. And
and I think that's that would be a great thing that obviously, say if you'd had a group of people from schools then going, that's something young people could form quite nicely, and that becomes the network. So when you mentioned during that question, what I was thinking of is a lot of the time where I've realized in the acting world is it's the same people doing the same things over and over again, and it's probably what is happening is someone said, oh, well, I've worked with you before, you're all right, you're reliable, let's use you again. And that's happening across the board. And you're right, it's often people are not even realizing what they're doing. And I think it's just because we're also so risk averse. Employers are generally risk averse, and I guess they would always choose someone who they either know or their friend knows or is somehow connected to their circle. And I wonder, yes, it's quite an interesting idea of having an equivalent for the working class community. And yes, I think it's important that, because then you can have representatives who sort of meet, and there can be that cross-pollination.
Yes.
But I think the huge barrier is it also then requires the middle class cabal to recognize that they have a network, because they probably don't even realize what they're doing. And that's the issue, is they need to then recognize the problem.
So somebody, let me find my quote. It was Julie Hesmond-Dolch in the acting class film. She said, art is political because it changes things. And she said, it's important, when she was talking about why, art is political because it changes things. And it's important that we see representations and stories across the whole of society, not just from some sections of society. And I think there was some clips, really good clips in the film. One of them was Boys from the Black Stuff, where they were talking about employment and what was happening in politics and the risk of things becoming a police state. And it was coming from the mouth of a working class bloke. Working class people, when their stories are told and when they're represented in the media, in films, and so on and so forth these days, as you said, it tends to be very caricatured, or it tends to be very judgmental. It's unpicking their lives, like the Jeremy Vine or Benefit Street or whatever, in a critical way. And those stories aren't coming from those people themselves. So again, it's down to the writing and the acting. But she was saying that in terms of the more middle class and affluent networks, it's important for people with stuff to keep their stuff. And it's important for people who have privilege to feel okay about the inequality that their own sort of lifestyles are causing. I just thought they were some really interesting observations. And when working class kids aspire and then attempt to break into these increasingly sort of affluent spheres, they need tools and awareness, I think, to be able to arm themselves to know what to expect, and that it is going to be tough, in lots of different ways.
Yeah. And it's so tricky because it's often will be so idiosyncratic depending on what particular world you're breaking into. And I think it really requires actually the middle class to step up and say, yes, we recognize our privilege here, and yes, we want to push to actually accept more people. It needs that middle class to take a bigger risk in terms of who they're hiring and who they are opening their networks to. What I see a lot these days of Instagram activism, and a lot of people are all posting about Black Lives Matter, and they're posting about equality and the rights of minorities. But what they're not doing is, they're all sort of like singing from the same hymn sheet to the choir. They're not actually expanding their horizons in terms of, say, approaching schools or approaching groups that may, such as, for example, actor awareness. They're not actually everyone wants to pay lip service to the idea of diversity and championing the underdog. But until we really, really actually start taking risks in who we are working with, and having a broader sense of idea about the sort of stories we can tell and what we consider worth focusing on as well, I think that it's really, we just need to expand, I think, our horizons in terms of how we see the world. It's not always from the same middle class prism. We really need to take a chance on people who have other ways of seeing life, because when we do that, then it will become an asset to have people from different backgrounds on board. But I think the problem is we're all still, as a society, we're still kind of all looking through the same, it is presented as aspirational to be looking through the middle class prism. And actually we need to start breaking that mold and saying, no, you can have a working class story, you can have a Black story, you can have an Asian story, and have a wonderful narrative and experience as part of that story. But we're still kind of in a very 1950s archaic model of what we want our beginning, middle, and end to be in terms of the art that we consume and the media that we consume. And it just means that it's all going through this middle class prism.
Yeah. It's a really interesting way of thinking of it. And I like how you've expressed that as a middle class prism. That really makes sense to me. And I think it's similar to what's happened with our shops in a way, if you could come up with an analogy where we used to have sort of, in the high street, you'd have like lots of individual shops and a broad different products and things like that. And it's become more homogenized. So all the high streets have got the same kinds of shops, and it almost feels as if that's what's happened. We're only getting to see that narrow perspective.
It's really interesting that you mentioned this, because there's a bit in my play which I'm now sort of working on into a film, and that this is actually something that I'm really going to expand on, because there is this massive rant that the main character has against pret-a-manger. And you see pret-a-mangers on every high street, and they are sadly, tragically, in lieu of all of those great mom and pop shops, the fish and chip shops, the sandwich outlets, those sort of really independent family-owned stores that we used to have and were a real mainstay of our culture, actually. And they've all been completely erased by pret-a-manger, which is commodified mediocrity. It's paying £4 for an awful sandwich, and it is catering entirely to middle-class professionals. And I just find it so interesting you made that parallel with the high street, because it is so true. We are now, everything is becoming boulderized and standardized, and it's just this sort of middle-class patina of blandness that is now infiltrating across society. And I just it is so sad, because again, that is another way in which those, when I say voices, I don't just mean in terms of like, film and TV. I mean within the community, that's the silencing of voices. That is the silencing of a business, of a family-run business that has its story, that's part of the culture of what makes this country so special. And again, that's now been replaced by pret-a-manger.
It's so much less interesting. It makes life so much less interesting, doesn't it?
Well, there's no point visiting every high street now looks the same.
It could be anywhere.
It's ridiculous. It's so sad, actually. I think it's really sad. Not just, and COVID is going to exacerbate that, because it's not going to be the pret-a-manger is going to be fine. As much as Rishi Sunak was saying that we all need to get back to work because of it's pret-a-manger will be fine. It will be those really small business owners, the very few ones who are left, actually, outside of the kind of corporate gamut, who are going to suffer. And the other thing that COVID is really going to exacerbate, and I was talking to Dee about this, was there is this. It's what she called leaky pipe syndrome. When you're already struggling, when you're already giving all of your energy and all of your extra energy to kind of rage against the machine and fight against these systems of privilege that exist, and these systems that are kind of designed, whether or not it was intentional, to exclude you. When all of your energy is being focused on that, and then you have something like COVID, which takes away your day job, which takes away any opportunity that you might have had to, say, get your work out there or to start your business, when all of that's kind of been robbed for a year, of course, the people who are going to struggle to find light at the end of the tunnel are going to be those ones who were already at a disadvantage to begin with. So,
absolutely.
COVID is really, what it's doing is it is only further polarizing the division of wealth within our society. And of course, that has major socioeconomic ramifications. And class is a huge part of that, because essentially the rich will get richer, the poor will get poorer.
What about when people want to talk about class only as an economic issue? They'd like to talk about poverty, but they don't really want to bring class into it, because class is a broader thing, isn't it, than just, it's not just about the money, is it? What do you think about that? Have you got
I suppose that it's interesting, and I suppose it comes down to how we define class, actually. And actually, while we're here, I'm just going to look it up and see sort of what the dictionary definitions are, because I'm genuinely interested in. So this one from Oxford Languages says social class is a division of society based on social and economic status. So a lot of the emphasis is definitely on those two things. I suppose when we know economic status, that's quite easy to define. I suppose
that's the money bit.
How do we define social status? And I think that is that's difficult for me to answer.
Yeah.
And I can really only speak from my experience, in terms of my family background. But there are, I'm sure, very affluent working class families and working class people who will have gone on to great success. And I wonder how that then transpires over the generation. I'm quite curious as to the kids of, say, as we might have said in Bradford, working class done good.
Yeah.
What is that experience like?
Yeah.
That I'd be quite interested to know.
Yeah. I've got some insights on that, I think, from my own kids, because we live in quite an affluent area, but we're from working class background. We did okay for a while, but I think when you're working class, if you're made redundant or something bad happens, you don't have that much of a cushion. So you're more likely to drop right back to where you started. And I think for kids who are from working class backgrounds, who live surrounded by affluence or whatever, where that happens, I think it can be really tough. My daughter, she feels more comfortable in Liverpool and in her job that she does as a waitress than she did in her school. She just feels as if she fits in more, and she never realized it. Culturally, she fits in more there, and she's more accepted there. And she didn't realize it until she actually went to college, left school and went to college and started a job. But Liverpool's quite a working class sort of a city. The culture is very sort of grounded, I think, in a lot of ways.
What was it that she specifically, if she mentioned anything that she did connect with?
Yeah, the teachers, she just found it that the teachers taught them a lot of basically socialist texts, at school. They did a lot of the things that they studied. They told the story of class inequality in lots of different ways. But yet they would still criticize the way that she spoke or the way that she dressed or make assumptions about her that could only really be based on class. And because I'm interested in politics and class, it's something that my daughter sort of rejected, because you never want to be interested in what your mum's interested in. But it was after like a number of years, she was like, oh, right, no, this is what this is. It's class discrimination kind of thing. It takes a while to dawn on people, and maybe what it is.
And subtle as well. And that is the thing with all forms of discrimination. There's always plausible deniability. And it is that subtlety which is why discrimination can thrive. So that is quite interesting. I mean, I suppose it's quite different for me because being from an Asian background as well, it's never quite, everything is sort of conflated. So I'm like, well, is this based on race, or is it a class thing, or is it based on, where I went to school or university? So it's tricky to ascertain specifically, I think, from my background, class in the purest sense. So that is interesting to sort of hear that she's felt the same way as well, even within the same country. It's never spoken about. And I'd actually even say that we rarely even speak about sexism. I think that women's rights are completely, I just feel that we don't have enough conversations around them. And when we do, it's often very sensationalized, or it's treated in a very kind of extreme way. And I don't hear anything about class at all. And it's almost like, oh, well, we've forgotten that. That's now, we're past that. We're a post-class society. But actually, really, when you think about things logically, this country was built on a system of class. I mean, that is how it helped become the class, then the class structure, which was inherited. I guess, once upon a time, there was this feudal system. We've continuously evolved from that. And we have, we've used the work, everyone has played a role in getting to where we are now, I suppose is what I'm saying. And we can't suddenly pretend that all those thousands of years of heritage, which have, led us up to this point, no longer matter or exist anymore. Of course, everything that we are today is entrenched in what came before. And this country in particular was built on a system of colonization and of class and the exploitation of the working class. And that has never been addressed because, those sort of scars, it's almost like that sense of genetic trauma, which people have begun talking about. It stays with us in our society. And that hasn't gone away. And yeah, we really don't talk about it at all. It's like we sort of want to shelve anything uncomfortable in the past under a rug and think, well, it's okay now. Everything is fine now. And actually it's not, because until we really address our history, we can't really address our present.
Yeah.
And it is, yeah, it's that, I suppose it's the opportunity. Maybe that's one way of defining it. It's the having less opportunity, or having to make opportunity yourself. And again, that comes back to, I think, what I was saying at the start about the definition of working class being that you really, really have to work for it. I mean, that's at least how I see. And not to say that people from middle class backgrounds don't work hard. That's not what I mean. But I'm talking about getting that first bit of opportunity to begin with, just even being able to recognize where the right door is, let alone getting a foot in the door. That is a huge part of it. And it does say a lot. And the problem is, because we don't talk about it, because it is a taboo, well, that makes it so hard to then define. And because yes, there isn't that protection, there isn't the conversation being had as there is around, other minority rights. And it is interesting, because I'm sure that my story is probably quite unique, but I'm sure that there's lots of people who have different, and it would just be really interesting to have a study and see what congruency exists between, say, my story or somebody else's story, or Tom's story in the acting class film. It'd be really good to see actually, how do we properly, away from money, define class. I don't know if that research has been done, but certainly nothing that I've ever come across. And I think that it would be a good thing to address in our society.
It fascinates me. I think there have been some really good studies in the past, but again, it's something that's kind of gone under the radar. It's not as much of there isn't as much of an emphasis within academia, and I think that's why Deirdre has set up she's worked with the organisation to set up the Journal of Culture and Class, which it's a brand new journal which is just dedicated to the issue of class, and I think if that can prompt some further research, I think that would be really, really good to see across various different professions, because I think what I pick up is that people are having the same kinds of experiences, and a lot of people who are from working class backgrounds, once they move into, if they manage to break through and they move into a sphere where it's a predominantly middle class arena, that makes class differences more visible than if they had just stayed within their own class level, if you know what I mean. So they're the people that need to be sharing and talking about this, and they're the people that we need to be involving in research, I think.
Yeah, and it's so hard because it stretches across all sort of strata of society. That yes, it would be really interesting to because I suppose it is. I tend to think of class still in terms of socioeconomic demographics, but really, I think it touches something much deeper, and it would be good to know really how do we distill that essence of the definition of class, because we all know it's there. We all know it's there, even if we don't talk about it. And I think it's really interesting as well. It's looking at our society versus the US, where there is class, but they say that it is a classless society. But even they it is still there. And it exists in other countries in very interesting ways. I'm just sort of thinking in India, there's the caste system, which is obviously it is very much its own thing, but there are similar, just in terms of human psychology, you can draw comparisons. And I'd be interested to know, because how class plays out in other countries around the world. Because we tend to also think of it as a very British thing when we do talk about it. Yeah, that's true. And yes, I wonder how, it'd be interesting to see that comparative research.
Yeah, I think working class people across, if you look at it in terms of what your relationship is to power, how much agency you've got, how much agency you're likely to be able to access as a citizen, if you know what I mean, and what your proximity to power is in that sense, compared to someone who's, from a different background. I think that's probably the common denominator across lots of different countries. Even though the levels of poverty might change, there probably are similar divisions in terms of how much of a political voice you have, how likely you are to be able to access the top of any given profession. or how many barriers you're likely to find in your way. It would be really interesting to study that, but it would be nice too, because I think it would be more helpful for us to be able to identify ourselves as a cross-global working class, which is multicultural, in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it may make it less of a taboo,
Yeah.
because it is, I mean, this would be something that we see replicated across societies around the world. And I think that's a really, really great definition, actually. I hadn't really thought of the idea of access to power. How would you define the level of access to power that you have? And maybe that's a good way of looking at class. And as I say, it's sort of tricky, I think, with everyone, because there are then things like gender and race do then come into play, and you're like, oh well, how it would have to be a very nuanced study.
But there are some already really good studies to go on to springboard off. It's just that they've been kind of left dormant almost. So they have looked, really closely at sort of people's networks and people's interactions and people's weak ties and stronger ties that enable them to get on, in different types of careers and things like that. They've looked at, even within policing, how young working class lads, we understand quite well now about racism within policing. We used to have conversations about class, but that's sort of disappeared from the narrative. But the studies used to show, there was a stark difference between working class kids and middle class kids. If the middle class kids were arrested for something, it was more likely to be put down to high spirits, whereas working class boys, it was more likely to be put down to delinquency, even if it was the same thing that they'd done, the same sort of behavior or whatever. So, in lots of different areas, we've been able to kind of study this in the past. It's just that we've let that conversation go. And it would be good to rekindle it. And it would be good to make, international comparisons within different countries as well. I think because, sort of within, say, Marxist theory, Marx recognized that there is this layer, which is the petty bourgeoisie, which we might call the middle class, who they provide a function in keeping the working class where they are and protecting those more affluent, billionaires or whatever, where they are. Their fear of not wanting to slip down means that they protect their own and each other in a certain way that keeps other people out. It not even necessarily a conscious thing, but
I think this is the key. And this is why we're not talking about it. It's because if we are looking at classes, then access to power, the people on that level of power don't want to, they can talk about racism, because racism we can think of in very esoteric terms. In the same way with sexism or with women's rights, we can think about that in a way that is still within our strata of society, still protects the overarching system. I think the problem is, this is why we don't talk about classes, because the people in power don't want to, they don't want to expose themselves, because this is the thing, it is protecting, as you say, it's those levels. And if one level suddenly starts to shine a light on what's going on, then it's, it could be chaos for the rest. So I think this is why, and this is the thing, it needs to be spoken about, because it is the people in power who are informing our media, informing debates in newspapers, or, on TV news. And that's why it needs to be addressed by the middle class, because it's great that as working class people we can talk about it and raise the issue, but if it's to get to that next level in terms of national debate and conversation, it does need to be exposed within the middle class itself. The problem is they would obviously all be reluctant to do so.
They're reluctant to hear it, and even within the Labour Party, which is a socialist party, the middle class are very reluctant to hear it, but nevertheless we crack on.
I do imagine that maybe, I can imagine somewhere like the Labour Party, again, because it is a question of power, probably has become more middle class over the years, I'm sure.
It's almost as if it's a mirror of what's happened within, TV and within film and every sphere. We've had this contraction of working class involvement, apart from within academia, where a lot more working class people go to university, but then it doesn't mean the same thing as it used to, in terms of what kind of job you're going to come out with. So Yeah, so it was a conversation. One sort of final question I wanted to ask you about, because you are obviously you are very successful in your career. I saw on your Twitter that you sold out at the Edinburgh Fringe 2019, and that you were listed as must see by The Guardian and by The Telegraph. So that's both sides of the coin in terms of left and
Yeah.
right. And the film Richard was it the play Richard?
So it was a play. It was a filmed play as well.
Okay, right, and that was alongside Ralph Fiennes and Vanessa Redgrave.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is mega. What was that like?
So I played a very, very small part in that. I didn't have any lines. So, I mean, it was great to be a part of, but it was, I mean, and the same thing with the Edinburgh stuff as well. One thing I will say is in terms of getting it, I am very much that person who was sending emails to people 3 times a day in terms of reviewers. And I was just constantly banging on the door in terms of wanting to get the goal I had in mind. And maybe if I'd been, for some people that might be easier because they may have known someone who knew someone at wherever. But I think with a lot of the things that I've done, and I do worry that I've lost this fire in the pandemic because it's been a year of not being in that world, and I'm worried that have I taken my foot off the gas? But a lot of it was really down to, I think, just pushing and wanting what I was going for. There's this quote from Madonna that I remember. She did a documentary, and she said she was speaking to her backing dancers, and they were talking about their goals, and she was speaking about being famous and her success. And she said to them, you can have anything you want in the world if you want it enough. And they were like, oh, well, yes, but I'm not sure. And she's like, no, that means you don't want it enough. And I thought that was just really interesting, that single-minded ambition that you can have, which can sort of get anyone from any background anywhere. And I think I really was channeling a lot of that with the work that I was getting when I was trying to break into the acting world and then sell my show ahead of the Fringe. Because also there was a big fear, I think, again, from that working class thing, is if the show had failed and I had ended up at a loss of thousands of pounds, I was just so terrified of the idea of there being any, because there is no cushion when you fail. And I was just so set, and I knew that with Edinburgh the odds are always in favor of the house, and there was this terror of wanting not to fail. And I think that that's actually coming from a working class background, because I was just like, I can't do this and be thousands of pounds in debt, or be in any more debt than I already was. And there was that push to success. And that was really pushing me, and I think that's that can be a good thing as well in terms of motivation. But it was great to do those things and to get that access and to be in that community. I mean, it was very different with like Ralph Fiennes and Vanessa Redgrave. Then it was a whole new level, because I mean that's not even like a class thing. It's like, well, they are, I think, upper middle class, if not maybe well, they're sort of royalty at this stage. I mean, the Redgraves are acting royalty. So that was a huge disparity, but that was something that was being felt even by middle class people when you're working with big stars. So it's sort of it's a tricky comparison. But I think that it was I really do credit my background with giving me that fight and that push, and that's what was driving me. And I think that's what was so great to, and what I was proud of myself for doing was, being able to pull that off.
Brilliant. That's a really inspiring kind of note to end on, because I think for any sort of working class kids who are interested in going into anything and succeeding, it's important for them to understand what the barriers are going to be like, but also to understand that being working class does give you, if there's something you really want to do, it does give you at least that fire and that fight, if you can get really singly determined, you need to know you're going to have to fight a lot harder. But being working class, kind of in a way, it equips you for that, doesn't it? So
I think so, and I definitely, and this has been quite a good thing to sort of, because obviously we are now at the end of the pandemic where the arts have been so massively hit, and so many people, and we were speaking earlier about this leaky pipe syndrome, where so many people from working class backgrounds are going to fall out, and that's definitely something for me to take forward, is channeling that sense of knowing that actually this is this is bigger than just my journey, because it is showing, hopefully, to other, maybe younger working class kids coming through, that you can do this, and it is possible, and it can be a great advantage to be from a working class background, because it gives you that fire like nothing else. So that's definitely something to hold on to.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, thank you so much for coming on, Osman. It's been great to meet you. I've been really interested in everything that you've shared with us today, so thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Democracy.